Now I'm going to move to the presentations here. So the question is about shadow. George, last time you got to go last. So you go first this time, then Skip, and then Brian. George, go ahead. 3 questions. What is shadow? What are the difficulties of handling, dealing with your shadow? And what are the rewards of doing that? And how does the shadow work? I mean, what do you do in shadow work? So you can, these are just general open-ended questions. So you can say anything you want to say about shadow. That will get things started. Go ahead, George.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you, Shrinkcat, for having me here. I appreciate it. What is shadow? I guess I'm just going to regurgitate a lot of the stuff I know, and I guess I'll try to spice it up a little bit as well. Basically, shadow is the reservoir of all the hidden material for the personal unconscious. And basically, it has 2 aspects. One aspect, which most of us are familiar with, is repressed material. The ego, the birth of the ego, and then its interface with collective consciousness. You have the be this and be not this. All that be not this is repressed, and it stays there. In other lexicons, they use the word trauma and so forth, to allude to it. But that's the repressed dimension. And also it's populated by what Jung calls the complexes. And that's an important proposition that needs to be unpacked as well. They're right there. They're these subliminal entities that exist in the shadow realm. The other dimension of the shadow will be what Jung calls the dormant material, all these potentials. And it gets tricky because, like, what's dormant shadow material and what's transpersonal, aka syzygy. Jung talks about that usually the genesis of shadow material is a psychic wound. And I would say that's called to understand, and we could get back to that. But that psychic wound becomes a motif throughout one's personal narrative. Jung also describes it, and I'm not sure if everyone received it, but I uploaded the essay from volume 9, part 2. Eon. It does a nice little. It differentiates, persona, ego, shadow, anima, animus, and the self. And I think these terms need to be, and I think if one is going to grapple with analytical psychology, one needs to have a sufficient awareness of what these propositions are. So I posted that up there, and I hope people read it. I think it's the second paragraph. Yes, it's the second paragraph that starts, the shadow is a moral problem. And for me, that's fascinating stuff. For me, one of the implications is that it's highly a subjective experience. I'm not dismissing the interpersonal aspect and other possibilities, but I am underscoring that it's a subjective, it's a deep exercise of introspection to intentionally encounter shadow material. And Jung calls that it's a moral problem. And we could talk more about that. What are the challenges? What are the rewards of the shadow? Okay, I guess I'll go back and forth. I'll try to start with challenges first. Jung talks about the tension of opposites, and that's one of the. I don't want to use the word duality, but that's one of this tension of opposites between ego material and shadow material. There's this what appears to be a disassociation that seems to be occurring. I don't like that term. I like the idea of fragmentation, but this association is good enough. But there's what's perceived to be a separation. But Jung talks about this tension of opposites. That again, it's a struggle. It's an existential struggle from the moment you're born. One of the challenges of shadow material is to take ownership of shadow material. Particularly, I mean, how do you become aware of that which you're unconscious of? It's pretty challenging. And Jung states that it happens all the time. Projections, they happen all the time. They're not within our perceptual field yet. We're unaware of them. So he talks about trying to catch, trying to become aware of these triggers, of these hooks. And that takes practice. That takes a lot of effort, particularly, if you're in an intimate relationship, with your spouse, with your children, with your parents, with your coworkers. And it's a two-way street, because objects become hooks for us, and we become objects for other egos, for other subjectivity. So it's an interesting conduit that goes there. What are the rewards? I think the obvious one is integration, wholeness. Again, it's a constant existential striving that one needs to do to integrate the shadow. And that's where it starts for me with regards to the process of individuation. How do you take ownership of those personal aspects that are psychically in proximity of your ego? One of the rewards, I think, of integrating one's shadow is creativity. One can become, one starts thinking outside of one's psychic box. One's ego expands. You become much more aware of your neurosis, of the purpose of your anxiety, not the pathology of your anxiety, but the purpose, the healing, the medicinal quality of your complexes. And that's an important attitude, I would say, within Jungian thought, within the Jungian approach. What's the last one? Shadow work. How does one do shadow work? I don't know, but I guess I'm going to share with you. You guys make me feel comfortable, so I'm going to get personal. When I was a kid, I used to play with G.I. Joes. Some of you guys remember what G.I. Joes are. It was a way for me just to deal with my aloneness. I had 5 other siblings, but I didn't know I was an introvert when I was 4 or 5 years old. But I had these dolls, these G.I. Joes, and I would spend literally 6, 8 days, excuse me, 6, 8 hours in the backyard, particularly if my parents, gave me permission. And I would engage and I would create my own world. Jung calls that active imagination. I didn't know that. For me, it was just playing. But it somehow gave me a release. It allowed me to express myself. For me, that's shadow work. And I think we're all doing shadow work. We just need to become aware of it and practice some sort of critical intention. So I think a way to do shadow work is to play. A way to do shadow work is to engage, again, what I mentioned earlier, intentional introspection, to be critical with reflections. So like, why did I have that fight with my wife? What was that about? Well, yeah, go through your existential emotional episodes, but then you got to sit down in a quiet space, respect silence, and be reflective on it critically on what's going on. There's usually a lot of feelings involved when you do a lot of shadow work. Of course, with the complexes. I don't know. I'm also thinking about if you guys read the work by Simone de Beauvoir, she talks about otherness. Most existentialists talks about that, but I think she articulates it quite well. I think in The Second Sex, and I think shadow work helps us to take ownership of otherness, if I'm permitted to express it that way. Okay, I think that's. Oh, I need to submit a question, right? I guess my question is the same one as last time. For the panel, for anyone else that's interested. And my question is, what is evil?
Thank you, George. Next one up is Skip. Skip, go ahead.
Okay, I'll frame this a little bit differently. From my perspective, shadow is everything that's unconscious. Your ego is your conscious mind. Everything that's unconscious is in the shadow. And it's the loss of the link between the shadow and the ego, which is the most dangerous thing for us. Because if you don't know what your shadow is, it may force you to do things that you don't want to do. So Dr. Jung was a little worried about, and Jungian analysts are often worried about, constellating the shadow before the ego is strong enough, because there are two streams from the unconscious. Dr. Jung always pointed to the biblical verse, 1 John 4:1, and that paraphrased is, test the spirits, whether they be of God or not, okay? Because you have one side that's a good you and another side that it is a bad you, but you need to have a strong enough ego so you can decide between right and wrong in your own right. And so I'm going to refer to Edward Edinger's book, The Ion Lectures, which is a very useful book in terms of understanding Ion. But of course, as George said, chapter 2 of Ion is very valuable in this respect. But what Dr. Edinger was pointed up was the confession that needs to be made to the goddess of truth in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And so I'm going to read this confession, and this is where an ego has separated itself from its shadow and said that everything is hunky-dory to the goddess of truth upon death, right? So he's trying to get into heaven. And so if I read anything that makes you uncomfortable, that is in your shadow, and you should be aware of it. So I'm just going to read this confession to the goddess of truth. Verily I come unto thee and bring before thee right and truth. For thy sake I have rejected wickedness. I have done no hurt unto man, nor have I wrought harm unto beasts. I have committed no crime in the place of right and truth. I have no knowledge of evil, nor have I acted wickedly. Each day have I labored more than is required of me. My name hath not come forth to the boat of the prince. I have not despised God. I have not caused misery. I have not that which God doth abominate. I have caused no wrong to be done to the servant by my master. I have caused none to feel pain. I have made no man to weep. I have not committed murder. I have not wronged the people. I have not filched that which hath been offered in the temples, nor have I purloined the cakes of the gods. I have not committed fornication. I have not added unto, nor have I diminished the offerings which are due. I have not stolen from the orchards. I have not added to the weight of the balance. I have not snatched the milk from the mouth of the babe. I have not driven the cattle from their pastures. I have not caught fishes with bait of their own bodies. I have not broken the channel of running water. I have not quenched the flame in its fullness. I have not thwarted the processions of the gods. I am pure, I am pure, I am pure, I am pure. And what Edinger says from the perspective of analysis, if an analysand is presented to him, he died in 1998, but came swearing that they were pure, then he knew that they were in a very delicate stage of ego development, and he couldn't really show them their own shadow. And so he says at the end of this segment, he says, which way one's analytic weight should be thrown depends on the evaluation of the patient's stage of ego development. And of course, Dr. Jung felt that one shouldn't embark on the individuation process until the ego was developed strong enough so that they can differentiate between right and wrong, because there is no definitive answer to what's good and evil. Now, what are the challenges and the rewards? Well, the challenge is to have a strong enough ego, and the rewards are a much fuller life and a much more flavorful life, because otherwise you're just normalized. And so Dr. Jung said, bring me a normal man and I will fix him for you, because society tends to normalize us, to cause us to be like everybody else, and individuation is about being like nobody else. and so so you have to learn how to connect to that. And so how is shadow work done by the individual? Well, it can be done by analysis of dreams and visions. It can be done
A ver
by...
si lo vemos.
Hello?
Uy, hace frío.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the question.
Sorry, there was a disturbance. I've muted that line. Go ahead.
Okay. So one way to do it is by doing anything creative and see what comes up. That can be painting, writing, dance, sculpture, anything that you can think of that would be creative. My creativity is in my YouTube channel, but I have done painting and I have done writing in my past, both good and bad. And I have had, manifest evil emerge. and Edinger was asked this question during his lecture on, I think it's his lecture on the myth for modern man, individuation. And he was asked, how do you do it? And he says, reflect on what you love and hate. Because if you hate something, that is certainly in you. And so you need to reflect on how that is in you, and that will make you a more conscious person. And the more consciousness you get in your lifetime, the better person you will be. Let's see. Well, I guess that's probably sufficient for now.
Okay. Thank you, Skip. So Brian, 3 questions. What do you think is shadow? What are the challenges of integrating your shadow, and what are the rewards? And how do you go about doing that?
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for being with us tonight, and thank my panelists too. Very thought-provoking start. definitely tough acts to follow, but I'll do my best to add something to the discussion. So first, what is the shadow? And there was someone in the chat who had talked about mindfulness meditation. I think this is kind of an interesting angle into this. The way I see it is there's a kind of spectrum of consciousness between what Heidegger would call Dasein, or just awareness or pure being without objects, and single pointed attention. For example, in mindfulness meditation, we might put it on our breath, or just in the task that we're doing, perhaps speaking to a panel without thoughts everywhere. That's one pointed attention. And I think we can think of the shadow as what just kind of habitually falls outside of our attention. And you know, in something like Jungian analysis, things are going to be kind of dynamic, and we're going to try to look at the entire personality. But what are those kind of things that we're just not looking at ever, that maybe are important to other humans that we just never look at? And so I really like to think of the shadow to start off with when it comes to attention. Now, a lot of times in the literature, in the parlance, you'll hear this term ego, things that are outside of the ego. I like to use the term personally in my practice, narrative self-identity. So narrative self-identity, what the story we're telling about ourselves. And you can just go look at your social media if you're into that. What are you telling people who you are when you go, when you habitually go out and someone's like, what do you do? Or what have you been up to? What are those things you're saying again and again? And importantly for shadow work, what are we leaving out? What aren't we talking about? If you read about the shadow, it'll like Skip said perfectly. You know, for Jung, the shadow is just what is unconscious. However, from a clinical perspective, we typically are looking at on a moral level. We're typically looking at things we fear, things we're disgusted by. I would say those are three big ones. If you are having those kind of emotional reactions, well, that's something on a clinical level we really want to check out. Why is that? So keep those three in mind. Also, Mr. Freud, Sigmund Freud, you know, that we have an ambivalent relationship with him sometimes in Jungian psychology, but I think he said something really interesting in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents, which is that, and I'm paraphrasing, the cost of civilization is neurosis. And I think, you know, we are animals. We have drives, and those don't always jive well with living together socially. And so the shadow is partially something that helps us play nice and helps us keep some of those more difficult things down, because we can't put everyone in society into Jungian analysis, and repression works fine for getting people to live in a city together. And so that's another thing. There's a social dimension to the shadow to keep in mind. And then someone also in the chat, I think it was Viman, had talked about, is there an evolutionary aspect to the shadow? I think there is.
Brian, we'll get to all the questions separately.
Okay.
We are going to give them the chance to kind of fully explicate their questions.
Okay, excellent.
And we'll come back to that.
Sorry about that. Yep, absolutely. Thanks for that clarification. But anyways, I do think there is an evolutionary purpose to the shadow. You can just do a Google search for something like the multi-agent model of mind, which is an interesting thing that's interesting convergences between clinical neuroscience and Jungian psychologies. We're finding that the mind is fragmented. There are sub-agents. And the way I like to think of the shadow and some neuroscientific ideas, about subagents, is that we seem to have, and this is a bit of a simplification, but a kind of structure that's kind of like an instinct to not burn your finger on a stove. So if you do something one time, we have instincts that are like, hey, don't do that, don't do that. We seem to have an instinct for kind of avoiding emotional pain. The challenge with that is that the mind can work in an associative way, and so the shadow can be this kind of network of associations of things, you know, that have caused us emotional pain. And there's a part of us that's like, don't go there. We don't want to go there because that part of us gives us pain. And so I think of the shadow like that. Some challenges with the shadow. Well, first of all, any kind of one thing that will happen when you start bringing awareness to your shadows, there will be a change in your personality, a transformation in your personality. And this puts a lot of pressure on relationships because people get quite used to how we are, and we have codependent relationships in both ways. and that will end as we start to integrate the shadow, or at least it will become more uncomfortable, and we won't be able to justify some of those relationships anymore. And that can be a big challenge to say goodbye or have a conflict with friends, loved ones, intimate relationships, etc. That's definitely been a huge challenge for me. Also, I think, just on a behavioral level, habits and inertia are difficult challenges to overcome. We might be able to bring awareness to something, but it's a different ballgame to shift things behaviorally. And that inertia is, I think, a big challenge with the shadow. And yeah, I'd mentioned about codependency. It's hard. It's hard to overcome. And that's a big challenge. Some benefits, though. I think there's a tension in our lives. Jung talks about this overarching 9-part discussion is about individuation. Provocative idea in Jungian psychology is that we have an impulse to flourish. That we have something that's innate that is calling us to fulfill our potential. But we definitely have a part of ourselves that wants us to survive as well. Jorge or George had talked about trauma. There's a part of it that's like, well, that flourishing, is scary, and there's a conflict there. And however, if we can, through shadow work with those traumatized parts and gently and compassionately demonstrate, like, hey, we can flourish and survive, and actually, part of our survival is flourishing. I think that's a huge benefit of shadow work. That right there. Also, I think by removing that fear of the like I had mentioned, the burning our stove, that metaphor, our potential is greatly expanded. We can maybe create. We can maybe go out. We can maybe do things that we're afraid of. So our potential is just what we're capable of, and we're willing to risk is enhanced through shadow work. I also think there's a great psychoanalyst, yes, in Britain named Adam Phillips, who talks about it's a misnomer to think that the true goal of psychoanalysis is to know yourself. It's actually, for him, and I think this is a good idea, a return of appetite, to realize that there's more to us than these unconscious dynamics, these traumas, these things that have happened to us. There's a greater world. There's causes to dedicate ourselves to. There's art to create. We can be great lovers. We can do these things that are important to us. That's what really matters. And through looking at the shadow, we can actually make space for that kind of thing. And then I'll say one more thing on the benefits. I think we can look at what's truly motivating us. Why do I want to be a doctor? Why do I need to date this woman or man? What is it? Because I love them? Is it because I find joy in being a doctor, or is it because dad or mom or whatever? What are my motivations to behave, and are they in alignment with my values? And then I'll just wrap up talking about how do we do shadow work. I'm kind of my co-panelists already brought great ideas to the fore. I'll start very quickly with, as Skip said, dreams and active imagination. Couldn't move past to talk about shadow work without that. We want to check out, for active imagination in particular, we want to check out the Red Book by Jung. Check out in particular, try to read the whole thing, but for shadow work in particular, you want to look at One of the Lowly, you want to look at 3 Prophecies, and you want to look at the Red One. And you can go to Skip's YouTube channel and check out he does, I'm pretty sure, some videos on those in particular. At least I know the Red One. And start there for the shadow. I think was Jung's shadow work, so we can start there if we're interested in active imagination. And also dreams. I just finished a great book called The Undiscovered Self, which was written by Jung in 1961, his last book. That's his final stand on dream analysis, on what that means to him. And check that out. It's a very, very good book. And I'll say just one more thing on. I'll say this. First of all, we've got to consult our resentment. And if we're resentful, that means there's something we're not doing. There's something we're not doing that's making us. We're keeping something bottled in. So if we're resentful about something, hey, why can't we repair this? Why can't we have this conversation? What are we afraid of? There. Also, I think on that vein, these 2 terms that seem opposite but are very linked to shadow are shame and glory. So what do you think is your glory? Like, what do you do to really puff yourself up? On the opposite end of that is there's something in the shadow, which is what we're ashamed of. They're almost, in Jungian psychology, we're interested in opposites, and those two things are often linked. And
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone for indulging.
Thanks, Brian. All right, now the each panelist gets to ask questions. Now, George was the first one to ask the question. So George, go ahead and you can ask the question. If you want, you can elaborate on the question and then have the other folks respond to that.
I'm just going to pose the question. There's really no elaboration. What is evil? By the way, I like what Brian brought up towards the end. I think, I suspect there's a kinship with evil and shame, but maybe not. But that's my question. What is evil?
So Brian or Skip, what is evil?
Okay. Well, first of all, evil is relative, and this was a main point that Dr. Jung made through his lifetime. But one of the points that he made right at the end of this essay that George has provided you, the last sentence of it, I'll just read it to you. In other words, it is quite within the bounds of possibility for a man to recognize the relative evil of his nature. And I've done that through the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But it is rare and shattering experience for him to gaze into the face of absolute evil. And so my question is, where have you seen the face of absolute evil in current affairs?
Brian, do you have any comments?
Well, I mean, it's a perennial question. It's absolutely fascinating one, George. I can just share some of my thinking on evil. Is I'm struck by there seems to be a kind of dichotomy in things I consider evil, and so things that I consider evil is just a kind of and maybe I could just posit two examples. Historical cultural examples in the last century. We have two things I think many of us would agree are evil. Definitely up for discussion, but Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, USSR, two places where I could say like the Gulag and the concentration camps, what went down there on a social level, I would consider both of those evil. And I think there's a weird kind of distinction there. In the German, there's this kind of, as Jung would say, the Wotan, this almost passion, this like overindulgence of drive and evil. It's almost like you can see in some of the romantic German poets, like there's this kind of love of animal passion, and it's this kind of giving up of the rationality and giving yourself over to the animal within. But then on the other hand, in the USSR, it's almost like the opposite in a sense. It's like a coldness, it's a rationality, it's a evil utilitarianism. It's the killing of some for the benefits of the so-called masses, which may be a myth. We don't have to go there politically. But I think of this, that evil is something that is like becoming out of balance with this beautiful human synthesis between instinct and rationality. And if we slip into either pole, I think those are just, I don't know if that's the definition of evil, but I see evil coming when we come out of balance with this. And I'll just use those two historical examples to try to enhance that point.
George, one of the panelists asked a great question. What is evil? What do you think is evil?
Well, I think I agree with what Skip was saying. By the way, I do want to say something about a comment that Brian said. Return to appetite. That's fascinating, man. Thank you. I'm going to take that home tonight. All right. What's evil? I'm gonna I mean, I disagree with Jung. I agree with Jung when he states that evil, the genesis of ego is differentiation. You know, it's consciousness. I mean, ironically, I guess paradoxically, it's consciousness. It's when we differentiate between this and that. In this case, good and evil. So we tend to repress one element of it, and usually we repress evil. But the psychogenesis is egoic, and for me that's very important. I hear a lot of people talk about evil is this unconscious element of human nature, and that never sat well with me. I think it's quite conscious, yet we repress it. You know, consequently, it's projected. And I agree with Brian. If I understood him correctly, historically, we have scapegoat the other. You know, in terms of collectivity, it's those socialists, it's those capitalists, it's those elitists, it's those proletarian, it's those women, it's those men. You know, it's seldom us. It's otherness. So I think evil is when you separate, and perhaps that's what I don't know who mentioned it. Was it Skip or Brian? That there's some sort of disassociation that occurs. But remember, disassociation assumes that there's conscious birth already, because within the unconscious there is no disassociation. Everything is wrapped up into one, you know, into some sort of primordial mercurial waters. But it's through consciousness that the ego emerges. And it's the central question in, well, one of the central questions in answer to Job. And I think it's a perennial question that not only it's within the perennial tradition, but that Jung has addressed. And for me, it's as a, how can I call myself? I was indoctrinated as a Catholic. And I'm not sure if it had clarity or more confusion to my disposition, but it's a question that has haunted me for a long time. And the older I've become, the more I realize that evil is part of my tapestry, and it shakes me. I get fearful. My body shakes. You know, my wife doesn't cook dinner. I want to kill her. Literally, I want to kill her. I know it sounds trivial. It sounds, you know, but it's you know, it's the different degrees. But just to illustrate the point, can I temper that? Yeah, I do. You know what I mean? I'm an ethical person, but the evil is there. That energy is there, and it can easily become intensified if I don't own it. So I think evil is when we don't own that aspect of ourselves, when it's differentiated. You know. So, you know, the yin and yang is differentiated. In this case, the good and the bad.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
So
Thank you.
let me give an example that is not too political here, but some may view it as political, but it's the difference between vegetarian, vegan, and a meat eater. Okay, and so vegetarian won't eat meat. Vegan won't eat anything that ever had a face, quote unquote, as I was told one time. And the point is that when you go into the grocery store, and this is going to open everybody's mind up, when you go to the grocery store, everything that you could buy there that you would eat was once alive. Okay, because all life lives on other life. And so some people regard eating meat as evil, and we're certainly seeing a lot of it's getting pushed in our face. As I think Brian was saying, that we repress things so we can live in civilization. So when you go to the meat counter and everything's all wrapped up nicely, and it just looks like a nice steak or a ground beef, you don't think about what went into having that ground beef or that steak in front of you and available to purchase. But you know, now we're getting it stuffed in our face because of coronavirus and all these meat processing plants that are having problems all over the Midwest. And so, one should reflect on, what is evil there and what is not evil. If you're a vegetarian, then you never heard a tomato scream, basically. So anyway, that's my thought.
Thank you. So now, next question. Brian, would you like to ask a question to the other two folks?
Yeah. So something George said struck me. So this idea of medicinal complexes. So to maybe Skip and George, I'm wondering if either of you could contrast the idea of Jung's idea of a complex, a personal complex, with maybe something we see in contemporary psychological discourse around diagnoses or whatever. And what's the difference between this view of complexes as potentially being medicinal and how we might diagnose a complex in traditional or contemporary psychology.
Well, I'm not a psychologist, and I hope never to be. And more power to you for pursuing that profession. And Brian and I have known each other for a couple of years here, and I'm very impressed by what he does in life. But in terms of medicinal complexes, I couldn't say because I'm not educated. I never took a psychology course. I've only been reading Jung for 33 years. So I know something about what Jung said, but I'm not a trained psychologist, so I wouldn't say anything about complexes per se. But one of the things that he highlighted in Memories, Dreams, Reflections in chapter 12 is a biblical verse that says something to the effect, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And so then he asks, who is wise as a serpent, and who, and what does it mean to be harmless as a dove? And if we think about the caduceus, which is the symbol of medicine, a poison can in small quantities can heal. Okay, now how do doctors heal? In large part, they call on the body to heal. So when I had my ankle replaced and they put steel in my ankle, that the surgeon referred to his work as carpentry. Okay, and so he basically sawed off a couple parts of my foot and stuck metal in there, but the healing wasn't his work. The healing came from my body. And so even 100 years ago, if you tried to replace your ankle, you would have gotten an abscess and probably would have died from that surgery. And so, you have to use some poison sometimes to heal. And so, it's a very vague idea, but the point is our body heals. Okay, our body does most of the healing, and doctors facilitate that, but they don't actually do the healing. We heal.
George, would you like to?
Yeah. It's not that easy to try to respond to that question, but I'm going to try to. I believe I said complexes are medicinal, not non-medicinal complexes. I think there's a difference. I think complexes are medicinal. Let me start by quoting, I forgot which logian it's from, but it's from the Gospel of Thomas. And I think it's a wonderful description of what a complex is for me. And I'll do my best. That which is within you, if you express that which is within you, that which is within you will save you. If you do not express that which is within you, that which is within you will destroy you. Just masticate on that for a while, okay? I think that's a wonderful allusion to what our complex is. Now we could get technically in terms of how they are composed, and I do, by the way, agree that they're evolutionary, and we could talk about that some other time or maybe later on. But complexes, I think, are medicinal because they will contribute to wholeness. It contributes to healing. But I agree with Skip. You need to have a strong ego. You could get overwhelmed by just the fumes alone, you know. With regards to the contrast between complexes, and I believe if I could use this label, a psychiatric diagnosis, you know, I think the complexes, you have much more of a scope to grapple with. I think a psychiatric diagnosis tends to be definitive, and usually it's approached pathologically. There's something wrong with you. It needs to be fixed. It needs to be medicated, and they'll use much more colorful language, but basically what they're trying to promote is dormancy. Let's put it to sleep. Let's not deal with that monster. Let's put it to sleep. And they'll have some sort of wonderful cognitive behavioral exercises that can work, but I don't think it will extinguish the existential vacuity and the existential explosion. Okay, that's genuinely actually sleeping. It's dormant. It's ready to erupt. But the idea of a complex is a lot, for me, it has to do with attitude. One approaches complexes with regards to their purpose and their medicinal qualities. I think a psychiatric diagnosis tends to be approached with an attitude of controlling it, not relating to it. With complex, we relate to complex. The other way, you try to control it, you try to somehow dismiss it with, you know, pharmaceuticals, you know, or with some sort of rational approach. I hope that that works, Brian.
Thank you. Well said. Beautiful.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
All right. Actually, there are 10 people now waiting in line to ask questions. Skip, do you have a quick question, or shall we go to the questions from the audience?
No, I asked my question, which is where have you seen the face of absolute evil? And it's more a rhetorical question.
Okay.
In current affairs.
Thank you. So let me go ahead, and so it's going to be, so let me remind you what the rules are. You have to raise, these are the 4 rules we have used in our meetups for past 3.5 years that have worked very well when we have such a large group. 4 rules. Number 1, raise your hand. The way you raise your hand is to type a question in the chat. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree with anything anybody says, but please be courteous in doing that. All right, so next up is Ukami, Steve, Roger, Theepan, Jim, Raul, V, Joseph, Jack, Tova, and Jairo. I don't know how to pronounce that. Jairo, probably. All right, Steve, you're next, please. So when called upon to ask a question, just unmute yourself, ask the question, and mute yourself back. No follow-up questions because we want to get to as many questions as possible. And keep asking questions, and we're going to come to as many questions as we can. All right, Steve, go ahead.
Okay, so this one is specifically for Brian, but anybody can answer it. And when Brian was speaking. So in essence, I say that shadow work can make you aware of the tendency to project shadow. Often our peers share enough with us that we have a common value system. This often leads to communal projection of our shadows. Once one has advanced in their shadow work, the critical examination of shadow projection can disrupt social cohesion. So in essence, when you're in a peer group, there's often kind of a boogeyman that the peer group agrees on is a really terrible person. You can all kind of use your imagination for the kind of boogeyman that we tend to use nowadays. And when you're aware of your own shadow, I think it kind of prevents you from doing that quite as often. So if you bring this up to your peer group, it can kind of be disruptive to this kind of cohesive practice of projecting the shadow onto other people. So it's kind of like a plus and a minus. So what do you think is a good way to address that challenge of having done shadow work?
It's a fantastic. It's Steve, right? Fantastic question, Steve. So I'll give I'll say, you know, it's something I had mentioned. You know, this is one of the challenges of shadow work as we're becoming more aware of our motivations, and I can just as a personal story. I remember when I was in high school, I was someone who would I would make a joke out of myself because I wanted to be liked all the time. And when I started becoming aware, it's like, wait, I don't like doing that, and I don't really need to be liked by you. I can just, you know, go home and read and have different friends. I started to need to do that less and less. But however, I think that's not, I think in certain situations, there's going to be relationships that you really want to keep. And so, you know, the Buddha talks about this great idea called skillful means. And it's where you don't, I'm forgetting the Sanskrit term for it, but it's kind of like, you know, recognizing that in your shadow work, someone might be at a different context and learning to communicate kind of skillfully, like, okay, where is this, how am I going to relate to this person, this piece of information that I have, in a way, while kind of recognizing like, okay, you know, this was the relationship we had, and they're going to be kind of surprised by this new perspective. Another thing I would say, so that's one thread to pull on, is check out the Buddha on skillful means. And then there's this other modality that I really like called non-violent communication, which is just, they have this great idea that says, you know, when setting personal boundaries and etc., before you do that, before you educate someone on the new truth, based on what you've discovered with your shadow work, trying to empathize with them first. You know, where are they going to come from when they hear this? So empathy before education, that's a big one for me, is when I discover something new about myself, realizing like this is going to be as big of a shock to them the first time they hear it as it was to me when I discovered it. And how can I make that process less painful? And but then I would just lastly say, you know, and we have rights, and you know, not every if people aren't going to respect them in a particular relationship, it's okay to just say goodbye as well. So I'd say empathy before education, and don't be afraid to just find a new relationships.
Thank you, Brian. Next up is Roger. Roger, go ahead.
Hi guys, and thank you all for the presentation or the discussion. I just had a quick question to see if there even is an issue here, but I was really curious if, from your guys' perspective, is there a risk with identifying with your shadow? So not just understanding that aspect is there, but seeing that aspect not just directly a part of you, but as you. So one step before or prior to integration, or one step where you recognize that part of you that is dark, but you, rather than try to integrate it into something that is of use, that is the thing that defines you. The fact that, for example, for George, the fact that there are those impulses to want to kill your wife when she hasn't cooked dinner, rather than seeing that as, oh, okay, I am capable of that. That is a part of me, is seeing that as, oh, that is me. That is the person that I am. And if there even is a difference, I guess.
Can I take a stab? Yeah.
Go right ahead.
Is there a risk? Yeah. There's always a risk. And I think I'm gonna try to respond to your questions and simultaneously respond to Steve's question, because I think it's an important one. By training, I'm a family therapist since 1988, and one of the things that that pops up all the time is this phenomenon known as the black sheep of the family. And black sheep are important. In many cases, they're probably one of the most powerful individuals within the family system. They're the hero in the family system. They're willing to be the hook for everybody else. And once you if you eliminate that black sheep out of that system is going to collapse. You need the black sheep in that family, okay? The older brother, the younger brother needs that middle brother to blame stuff on, okay? And I'm trying to be real about this. Now imagine taking ownership, and again, to Steve's question, once you start owning that which you're projecting onto your brother, you're going to find out, and this is your question, Rod, you're going to take a risk. That relationship between you and your brother, those personal transactions that goes between you and your brother, they're going to change. And some of us cannot deal with it because we have an investment in our persona with regards to our discourse with our brothers, with our brethren. And many of us are unwilling to let go of our investment in our persona. So there is a risk. What's the risk? A disorientation, of the personality, a reconfiguration. And most of us are unwilling to exert that type of energy. And it does become, it does begin with awareness. And with that awareness, you need to exercise will. Okay, and by exercising your will, the egoic will, you're taking the risk of redistributing the relationship, the transaction between the other. Okay, in this case, the black sheep or anyone else or any other role. So I'm trying to simultaneously respond to Roger's and Steve's question because I think they're both related.
Excellent. Thank you, George. Next question is from Theepan. So it's going to be Theepan, Jim, Raul, V, Joseph, Jack, Tova, Jairo, Fakal. Theepan, go ahead.
Hey everyone, thanks for doing this. I'm really enjoying it so far. I'll just ask what my original question was, which was, does the shadow have an evolutionary purpose or is it a byproduct of human psychology? Because I've seen it explained in both ways. So yeah, that's my question.
Can I jump in on this one?
Please, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is a great question, Theepan. I personally think there's a strong evolutionary link between ideas, what Jung is talking about when he's modeling the shadow. In particular, I would say if you want to pull on that thread, check out the like I mentioned in my opening chat, the multi-agent model of mind. And yeah, it makes sense from a survival perspective that, from just reproducing our genes, we don't necessarily need to flourish at all times. And I think that's one of the fundamental tensions between Jungian psychology and evolutionary psychology is this, on one hand, this urge or this telos towards wholeness to individuation. And then on an evolutionary perspective, hey, we really just need to have kids and give someone else a chance to maybe do that. I think the tensions between that, I need to stay safe in this bubble. I can't get rejected. I can't, because that's associated with emotional pain. I can't speak in front of crowds, whatever it is, because I don't want to be judged, because I need to survive in this tribe. It's fundamental to the shadow. And the Jungian aspect of the self and individuation, the tension between those two things, that no, you need to try that. That's why you're here. I think that is like really for my personal work, that's like the essence of shadow work. But there's definitely something to be said for, hey, like there's a reason we're not going here. This hurt us. We were hurt, and like we have instincts to pull away from a stove, we're gonna have instincts to pull away and ignore things that create emotional pain as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
Next one up is Jim.
Thank you.
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So it's a simple question. If parts of my shadow are in my unconscious, subconscious, and I'm not consciously aware of them, how do I become aware of them? Is it meditation, psychotherapy, men's groups, all of the above? I'm looking for techniques and steps, I guess, to start the process.
Well, there are a lot of self-help books on dealing with the unconscious, and the answer to your question, the way you put it, is yes, all those things, because all those things will introduce you to your shadow. But what I would say is, either go to the Sears tool department or the local art store, depending on your preference, whether you want to be sawing things or painting things, and see what item attracts you. Okay, something will attract you, whether it's a circular saw or a set of paints, and pick that up and start doing something with it, anything, and your unconscious will start to talk to you, and when it does, pay attention.
Okay, next question is by Raul. Raul, go ahead.
Hey guys. Well, I was curious also. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious, like also others before me, about the awareness of the shadow and mindfulness, meditations, self-reflection, journaling, some methods which come in my mind in determining, identifying the shadow part. It made me think that as soon as it's known, becomes known to the individual, isn't it transformed from a shadow to a seen part of the self? And besides that, I was hearing the other examples with the black sheep or other sides. There could be also positive.
Sorry, I think we've lost the audio, but he's put part of the question down, so please go ahead.
Isn't it the seen part of the self? And yes, it is. You might be in a crime family, and you realize that you like doing things that are done in crime families, and so you go to the dark side. Yes, that can happen, and it may change your personality. This is depicted in lots of movies where people, go to organized crime, and they just start with The Godfather. It's a good place to start, because Michael came back from the war, and he was a courageous Marine who had won, I think, either the Navy Cross or the Silver Star. And so he was a hero in the opening scene of The Godfather. And, things changed. And, that's a very instructive series, but especially Godfather 1, but the whole series is a very instructive series about the shadow and how it emerges, and who deals with it well and who doesn't.
Thank you, Skip. Next up, so it's going to be V, Joseph, Jack, Tova, Chairo, Fakel, Gang. V, go ahead. W-E, V. Nope. Okay. Next is, just a second. Next one is Joseph. Joe, go ahead. Joe,
Hi.
yes.
Just a quick question about what one of the comments that George had made was pertaining to how shame relates to evil. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that, because I always looked at shame as something that could be a way of managing desires and our pathologies in certain cases. So I think it can be a negative, but I would just like to hear how that relates to the actual evil aspect of that.
Okay, who would like to take that?
I think Brian should respond to that one.
Sure. It's a provocative point. I'd never put together shame. It makes sense to me. I mean, I could see that as a shame is potentially. I'd want to dialogue with George a little bit on it, but I could see shame and something you had said that was interesting too, Joseph, about maybe shame as a way as like a kind of taboo. It's like, here's our line. This is what killing or God forbid, sexual violence or something like that. There's a line here. There's a taboo. Again, I'm here I am as a training Jungian analyst, and I'm talking about Freud again for the second time in another book. But there's Totem and Taboo by Sigmund Freud, which is a fascinating book. And what's on the other side of that taboo and the totems that represented them is often shame. It's the heroin addict, the pedophile, etc. And I could see that that this kind of social. I maybe, because of issues in my own personal psychology, don't necessarily want to link evil and shame because of my fear of crowds and where that goes wrong, and because shame is so linked with the crowd looking at you and saying you're wrong and you're bad and get out of here. Because I'm scared of that personally. I don't want to give the crowd that authority, maybe. But I think definitely there are things that we all can agree on that that many of us, I shouldn't say all, agree that this is bad, and those are often classified as evil. And maybe that action of letting people know how we feel, there's a link there. That makes sense to me.
Thanks. Thanks, Brian. I'm going to ask the question by V. He's typed it up. The question he or she asks, can we by ourselves alone detach, view, and deal and handle at an emotional distance our own shadows, repression, fears, anxiety, feelings, like a self-viewing, and competently handle the mind similar to a programmer handles a computer, upload, modify, or unload softwares. Like a programmer is always unaffected by the computer or software. So it's a question of distance. Can one do it themselves? Skip.
I think it can, and because I've done it myself, but it's not easy to do. And that's why many do go to psychotherapists to help them through it. And I'll just give you an example from my own experience. In 1993, I had an archetypal possession, let's say, an archetypal possession, and that caused me to. It lasted for 8 months. And during that period, I wrote a novel. Now, in that novel, there were pornographic sections, and I was in the middle of my business career, and I said, wow, I can't publish this. What does it mean? And I put it in my drawer. And many people think pornography is shameful, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go there, but the point is I put it in my drawer for 21 years, but I always knew that there was something valuable in it for me, and I didn't publish it until I could explain it from a Jungian perspective and talk about it from a Jungian perspective. Now, I did that by a lot of serious reading in Carl Jung. And so I wouldn't say it's easy. And so you know, I don't recommend trying to do it by yourself. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Skip. Next up is Tova.
Hello, everyone. I've forgotten my question, but I think I've remembered it now. It was mentioned that consciousness or disassociation assumes consciousness. I guess I was just wondering, like, what the connection was between the two of them, and how, in a way, like, consciousness can then assume disassociation, and what is the link, and how and in what ways they're connected.
Okay, who would like to take that?
I think Brian better take that, or George, as professional mental health professionals.
What do you think, George? I think you were talking about, yeah, please.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. But again, if I leave too many holes, please plug them in. But I think that's for me, that's original sin on disassociation. It's a perennial motif within the human condition. When this and that separated, that's what it simply means, you know. In this case, the birth of the ego. Once the ego is born, again, pure subjectivity, it's disassociated from the objective psyche. Okay, so once the ego is born, it's disassociated. So how do you rearticulate? How do you re-correspond with the objective psyche? You know, intentionally. Well, culture, again, it's supposed to facilitate that, right? But ironically, it doesn't. I think culture, through its primary faculty, which is conforming, and I think that's what Skip was talking about earlier on, if I understood him correctly, is through conformity, we kind of scaffold this separation. We magnify the disassociation. So for me, disassociation implies consciousness. Because if there is no consciousness, because again, that's a fundamental difference between Jung and Freud. For Freud, unconsciousness is fabricated by consciousness. For Jung, he says no, consciousness emerges from the unconscious. And through that emergence, there's a separation. The birth of the ego implies a disassociation from the objective psyche, the self. Okay, and then there's the birth of shadow material. So there's this association between ego and shadow, ego and self. So how do you marry them again? So I hope that makes sense with regard to disassociation.
It's not easy to do, but it's certainly you know, an example would be an organization that's very fixed in its ways, and it becomes the power devil, and then there's a dissociation. So the example would be the Catholic Church, where the power devil got the Catholic Church to start selling indulgences. And Martin Luther says, wait a minute, that isn't what Christ was about. And so he dissociates from the Catholic Church. He breaks away from it. So what happened? Then there was split after split after split, and we now have 400 or so Protestant denominations, and apparently there are 5 Catholic denominations. And so that dissociation is ultimately starts to get bad, to the point where the integrity of society gets challenged when Nietzsche states the obvious, God is dead. Well, God is dead in the way that it was sold to humanity to build civilization over 2,000 years. That God is dead because the scientific method killed it, killed God. But Jung found God where he lives and how he goes about doing the business of the Godhead. And so we need for those groups to now reassociate. And if we do, we will have some sort of sanity in the Western world.
Thank you.
I'll leave it at that. That's very general, but
okay. Thanks.
Skip does a I believe, Skip, you do these wonderful talks on the Red Book. And the Red Book starts with Jung saying, "Where's my soul?" You know, basically. That implies that this is this association between ego and anima, and in his case, the anima. So he's on a journey to rearticulate himself with soul material, with soulness. You know,
Right.
so
He was on a journey to rearticulate the eros. Okay.
there you go. Yeah.
All right. Because, well, my intuition about this, which others may not agree, but the logos, everything that's logos is a scaffolding. It's dead. There's nothing to it. I try to wake people up by showing a Bible and saying, you know, this is just a black doorstop full of logos, but it's a black doorstop until people put life into it. Okay. And that's eros. And so eros has gotten a bad name over 2,000 years, let's say. But the reality is that the church fathers knew that it was about eros all along. And so you have to think about, I mean, it's the dichotomy is not really logos against eros. The dichotomy is logos against life. You know, everything in your room that you have was made by perfect logos, okay? But none of it is alive. None of it, okay? And so you have to put life into it. You put life into it by getting it and working with it and doing things with it. Then that's eros, that's life. But, you know, if you have a circular saw in your basement, it's just pure logos until you go down and start making a piece of furniture with that circular saw.
Thank you, Skip. That was great. Next up is Jairo. Jairo Moreno. You need to unmute yourself to speak. Oh, okay. Next one is Faisal. Faisal, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I was just curious about the process related to the shadows and and the integration, and so whether there's anything in particular Jung say about how do we know and why do we know we've integrated some of those shadow aspects that in terms of like the complexes. I feel like it's a little bit clearer just because there's sort of energy that gets sort of freed when the complexes have been sort of reshuffled. I feel, but I'm not so sure about how the those aspects of the shadow gets gets integrated and what one know about them. That makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, panel, you mind if I jump in on this one? Great. So I think this is it's a great question. So the idea of the process or various techniques for shadow integration has come up a few times. I think it might be useful to take a moment to think on some of Jung's engagements with the East, actually. So there's I would suggest checking out his introduction to The Secret of the Golden Flower. Really one of the most fascinating Jungian texts. I think it's overlooked sometimes. And I think sometimes I just saw a really interesting data analysis comparing books like the Tao Te Ching and the various Taoist texts, the I Ching, etc., and art classics in the West, like Aristotle, Plato, etc. And what's fascinating is in the West, we have a bias towards nouns. We like to know when the shadow is fully integrated. I think Jungian psychology sometimes is a compensation in the opposite direction. It's very process-oriented. So this may be good or bad news, but shadow integration tends to go on. I mean, even in Jung's life, it continues to go on. And that's actually, I mean, if you look at the image in the Golden Flower and in many of the images in the Red Book, they're mandalas, which are dynamic. It's great news when your mandala is there. The process of the self is the way. It gets a little almost new agey, but it is. It's the individuation. The self is there already, and we are adding things to it into our mandala, and so that shadow process continues. And we really, I think, want to. I think George had mentioned play. Jung played with his blocks too at the tower. That's how this whole process in the Red Book got started. Is he went back to his rock playing games. So through continually through following our fascination, as Joseph Campbell said, following our bliss through life, that process, that shadow integration process continues, and our mandala of the self and the individuation process grows. And so don't sweat it. I'll make one book suggestion or essay suggestion. My analyst, Stanton Marlin from Pittsburgh, wrote a paper called The Value of Slowness. And check that out, The Value of Slowness. The shadow integration will go on for a while, and that's good. That's fun, because that's what we want. That's what I'll say.
I would recommend getting yourself a kaleidoscope. My wife calls me her kaleidoscope. And if you get a kaleidoscope, you'll see that, if you make any change, the kaleidoscope will be different, but it will still be a mandala. and so get yourself a kaleidoscope and stare through it for an hour or two every couple of weeks. You'll get the idea.
Thank you. Next up is Gang. Gang, go ahead.
So I'd like to ask, you mentioned the art process actually helps integrate your shadow. I'm an architect, so I actually recently started doing some watercoloring class. I really love it because it's so funny. The reason I studied architecture because I really like drawing since I was very young. And I'm good with physics. I thought, the integration of this will be architect. So I only study architecture, only applied school in architecture. But the funny part is, since I study architecture, I don't like drawing anymore. So then it's actually become my job. I don't enjoy it as when I was young. I draw everywhere,
Gang, what's your question?
So my question is how that art process is that, because when I start to do the watercolor, I really enjoy it a lot. I really have fun, but I'm not sure if this integrate my shadow or how do you know so I just enjoy the process, but I'm not sure it's helped me to integrate my shadow or not.
Okay, thank you.
Do you know through this creative process or how it helps you to integrate your shadow? Or do you know it is integrate your shadow or not?
Your life will work better.
Oh,
okay.
Anybody
else does anybody else want to comment? Okay.
I do want to say that integration is going to happen, either intentional or not unintentional. It's going to happen. Jung says he has a preference towards exercising your will. So you need to have intention. Active imagination can do that. There's a diversity. So integration will occur. If it's unintentional, then it's going to be projected. Projection is integration. Okay, but there's no exercise of will there. Okay, so it's much more constructive if it's intentional. Now, with regards to Jen's question, just keep doing it. I mean, be alert, exercise vigilance, and perhaps one day, I don't know, I'm just guessing. Perhaps you have a tendency towards order. I guess architecture and painting, in this case with watercolor, it may allow the emergence of your acrimonious relationship with disorder. I'm making this up. I don't know. You need to make that decision. So keep playing with those exercises, but with vigilance.
Thank you.
And if you don't like painting anymore, then take up a different art.
There you go.
Last two questions, and then we are going to go to the breakout rooms. So questions from Chris and then Jacobo. Chris, go ahead.
So I heard you guys earlier talking about kind of having a strong ego to overcome the shadow. That was my understanding of kind of how it was being phrased. And I never really thought of the ego as being, a positive force, so my question is just kind of like, is it not more kind of really is the ego not really kind of the deceptive voice in our heads keeping us from our shadow? So in other words, is the shadow not kind of, yes, it's inferior, but it's like the point we need to get to, and is the ego actually in the way of that? And if so, how do we overcome that piece?
Jung would tell you you need a strong ego to deal with your shadow. And he didn't want people starting the individuation process too young, because their ego is not well formed. I mean, that's the verse in the Bible that I mentioned, 1 John 4:1. Take a look at it. The ego has to be able to deal with what's coming from the magma below your conscious mind. And some people say, no more ideas, please, because sometimes those ideas can be pretty extreme. And so you have to be able to handle it.
Yeah.
Thank
Can I
you.
make just one quick comment? Yeah, Chris, great question. I think there's a really provocative passage in the Red Book in the section on the anchorite, where the anchorite is talking to Jung's ego about how the logos doesn't come from above, and very similar to what Skip's been talking about, how we bring life into these concepts is crucially important, and we are a mirror for them, for Jung. And so he's a bit of an ego apologist, I would say, and that's a really fascinating thread to pull on. But I think, as Skip was saying, check out, to build on that, check out the anchorite and kind of meditate on that, because there's many convergences with the Book of John in there.
Wonderful. Last question by Jacobo. Jacobo, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jacobo. I'm new here. This question is specifically for Skip Conover, seeing as how I've watched his videos, and in said videos he talked about being like a veteran, a Vietnam War vet. Today we have problems like school shootings, suicides. It's basically people killing themselves to like prove themselves. And is this this is because like they haven't exactly like integrated their shadow? And how exactly do we go about said process?
This is a fundamental problem of modern life right now, because we don't have enough initiation of young men. And so I'll just give you an example. Back when there was a shooting in the nightclub in Paris, and Anderson Cooper was going around Paris trying to figure out why this happened. And he came to two older Muslim men, and he said, why do these Muslim men go off to Syria to fight for, Al-Qaeda or whatever? And these Muslim men said, well, they live in a very poor environment, and they have no way to prove themselves as a man. Okay, and so, it's the Marine Corps motto is the Marine Corps builds men. And it doesn't mean that you have to become a soldier or a fighter. It means you have to build strength. So two of my strongest friends that I know are men that didn't serve in Vietnam, okay, who proved themselves as men by not going, by resisting, by demonstrating against it, or in one case by deserting. They prove themselves as men by believing in their convictions. But when battle is not a very great way to do it. I mean, actual battle. I'm talking, the Marine Corps initiation is all well and good, but we have veterans coming back who were brought up on video games, and when you get into battle, it's quite a different thing. You know, as George C. Scott said in the movie Patton at the beginning, he said, when you put your hand into a bunch of goo that a moment before was your best friend's face, you'll know what to do. And that's the possession of the warrior instinct, of the warrior archetype, right? And so men have to prove themselves as men somehow, and we don't have enough mental health for troops coming back from battle. So, you know, even in Roman times, when the legions would come back from Gaul or wherever, they would make them stay outside of Rome, 20 miles outside of Rome, for 6 or 8 weeks to bring them down, to make them come back down to be civilized before they allowed them to come into society. Because even in those times, they knew that, you know, being in battle was a big deal. And so, you know, young men need to prove themselves at a very deep level. It's archetypal. It's the warrior archetype, and we don't have enough initiation. It's a big issue, and that's, you know, for all men. I mean, it applies to Muslim men as example of that story I told you, but you know, all men need a way to prove themselves as a man. Now, how you do that is your business. It doesn't mean you have to be a soldier, but it means you have to find a way that you're going to initiate yourself one way or another.
Thank you. Thank you, Skip. Now what we're going to do is that we're going to do closing statements. Keep them very brief, maybe 2 minutes, in any kind of last thoughts that you have. And then we're going to go to breakout rooms. We're running a little late, so we'll do just one round of breakout room. We divide into groups of about maybe 6 to 8. Just want to tell you that today we screwed up on our technology. We maxed out at 100, and there were lots of people trying to get in. There was a kind of overflow room in Discord that handled maybe about 10, 15 people, and many of them gave up. What we have done is that we are doing a YouTube channel. So we'll make recordings of this available for people so they can go and listen. So I'll make sure. And we're going to increase our Zoom limit to 300 or 500 or something like that, so we don't run into this problem again. Okay, so I'm sorry about that, but we'll fix that. So with that, I'm going to give a chance for closing statements. So we'll go in the opposite order. So Brian, Skip, and George, just 2 minutes, 2 minutes each. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I appreciate the opportunity and for all your thought-provoking questions, and thank my panelists as well. And thank you for organizing and facilitating so excellently. I'll just say there's a lot of talk about, I'll just underscore a point I made to a questioner about the value of slowness, and maybe building off something George and I were dialoguing about. We have a habit to want to fix things and pathologize things, the shadows, and it can be very generative. Maybe not move into I need to get to the next step of evolution, but have some fun and some play and enjoyment of becoming conscious. And when you something in my analysis, taking months on one dream. Is something to just try out. I think that value of Jung spent decades on the Red Book, on that the inner craftsman, taking that archetype to heart, I think can be a valuable thing to try out, especially with shadow work, and not to rush things too far. And so I'll end on that.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, wonderful. Skip.
Well, let's see. Okay.
Yes.
I like Gertrude Stein's verse about, and you need to keep this in mind with anything around Jung, in terms of the truth. There ain't no answer. There ain't going to be no answer. There never has been any answer. That's the answer. Okay. And Jung, for his whole lifetime, was creating things. The building that's behind me in my image here is Bollingen, which is a house that he built with his bare hands over a 16-year period in four stages. And he never plumbed it, and he never put electricity in it because he wanted it to be like a medieval house. He said that the only thing a medieval man that would find out of place in his house was the matches. And so he was trying to get back to a point where he could hear his unconscious. And he spent a lot of time out there over from 1923 onward until his death. And so, you know, I go to a Buddhist meditation group because it makes me consciously meditate once a week. I mean, I think of myself as constantly in meditation, but I consciously meditate in the Buddhist way once a week. And it allows me to hear my unconscious. And so if you want to know something about your shadow, you have to stop and listen.
Thank you, Skip. Beautiful. George?
Yeah, I want to end by reading a quote from Edward Edinger. But as a preface, I just want to mention that remember, shadow work is not just individual work. Shadow work as well, and Neumann put this forward, is collective. And for me, I have a big interest in the collective shadow, and I think that has to do that's connected with what the person mentioned. I forgot whom in particular regarding the shooting. I think there's been a split between the eros and the logos, and an addiction towards either or is problematic, you know. So I'm going to read with Edinger's quote. I'm unfortunate I can't give you the citation, but maybe Skip, it might sound familiar to him and he'll be able to decide it for you. Jung psychology offers not only a method for psychological healing of individuals, but also a new world view for Western man, which holds out the possibility for healing the spirit in the contemporary collective psyche. That's why I follow Jungian thought, and I think that addresses the imperative to integrate not only the individual shadow, and it begins there, but there's also the imperative to integrate the collective shadow.
Wow.
We definitely have to integrate the collective shadow. And, you know, I'll go back to my comment that Jung found the living God where he lives and how he goes about doing the business of the Godhead. And I spoke for an hour and a half on that last October, so you can find that in my lecture called Finding the Living God. And I'm in total agreement with George that we have to heal the collective shadow, very definitely. And
wonderful. This was an amazing panel. So thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, Skip. Thank you, George. This was great. So let me tell you a couple of things. So the next discussion is going to be on Sunday at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time, and that's going to be on anima and animus. And the one after that is going to be again the next Thursday, and that's going to be on persona. So now just sit tight. I'm going to divide you into smaller rooms of about maybe 7-8 people each. Give me just a second. You will get a pop-up inviting you to join a room, and you just accept it. So we're going to run these rooms for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll be done. Give me just a second. It's about 4. Okay. All right.
like how you know, he emphasizes the dream analysis and, you know, other ways to get there. So yeah, you know, in honor of him, I try to remember my dreams.
There we go. Cool. Very good. Up, you're muted.
You're muted. Yeah.
Sorry about that. Brian, one of the rooms does not have a speaker, so can I move you over there? Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
See y'all later.
Can I share something?
Hey, Jenny, it's you. How are you?
How's it going?
Good.
Yeah, it was interesting presentations. I've been in therapy throughout my life by choice. I'm not in therapy now. I've undergone Jungian therapy for several years, many years ago. You know, the beauty of getting older, and if you're still, you know, and I meditate, I've had a mindfulness practice for many, many years. You're always learning. But the beauty of getting older, and if you're still engaged in self-awareness and journaling, is that you do start seeing parts of you that you haven't looked at or are not that appealing. You're able to do that. And I see that as the beauty of aging.
So you don't need a technique, you just need to.
About in the discussion, or I guess even Jung, just like split, parts being split off from you, and the Bible being a reflection of that psychological process, you know, displayed symbolically through original sin, or even like eating the fruit from the tree and stuff, and developing self-consciousness, like how Peterson says. But yeah, that's my thought on it. I don't have too much to say.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How was the discussion? How are the panels?
It was good. I really enjoyed Skip. Like I was watching videos from him before, so I recognized him right away. The other two I'm not as familiar with.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, man. I think this format is good because you have all of these people, they get to speak their mind, they get to kind of bounce off each other. So I think it works really well. You know, Carl Jung is a very deep topic. So this is a very good way of doing that. And I also like these rooms because they allow you to kind of then talk about this. So, wonderful.
Yeah, I thought it was A+. Yeah, it was really good. It's good on a topic like this. There's almost not a magic's too strong a word, but like you were saying, when they riff off each other and distill stuff, you almost get in a little bit of a trance, and you can start to feel the territory. It's rather than it being intellectualized or.
Absolutely.
They're good. They're good guys.
Yeah, and I think what happens is it's very interesting. Like in our group, we kind of have kind of moved continuously between Jung and Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson is, I think he's far more clearer to understand, and he kind of brings together many things like biology and history and various things, and his communication ability of making it very real to people is just amazing. Of course, Jung's depth is, as Jordan Peterson puts it, it is scary, you know, but the depth, and like, you know, it's like even a single sentence or just a paragraph, you know, he can just do wonders. So it's wonderful to be able to have like Jordan Peterson as a guide, and then you use, go between the two.
So I wasn't there on whatever day you did the Jordan Peterson one with Shadow.
Yes.
But one of the things that I've noticed is that Peterson doesn't mention is a lot of the totality of Jung's concept of the shadow. Like Peterson mainly talks about integrating aggression and some of the dark aspects of it. But Jung has a more comprehensive view of the shadow, from my understanding, that includes what people refer to as a golden shadow, or like even positive traits, right? So shadow is generally those aspects of you which you deny from your from your identity. But those can also include positive aspects, not just negative ones. So things like everyone else is very like they're all smart, but I'm not smart, or something like that. So that would be, I guess, a positive thing. So I don't know what could you just maybe fill me in on some of the things that were really interesting during the meetup for Peterson regarding shadow.
I mean, we went through. I mean, the person who was presenting it, my friend Roger. I mean, his take. When we talk, I met him only like maybe about 4 weeks ago. He runs the Jordan Peterson meetup in DC, but we kind of see completely eye to eye on pretty much everything on these topics. So his kind of comment to me was like, Peterson is a lightweight. Jung is where all the action is. So it is the depth of Jung is truly amazing. And what happens is that I think many people kind of get some part of it, some part of Jung, and explicate it. Now there is a tremendous value to it of being able to do that. But I think the depth of Jung is it's amazing. Like for example, I mean, one of the things, part of Jung that I'm most familiar with is his psychological functions. And there is, Myers-Briggs and MBTI. Yeah. They also use those functions, but you see them use them, and then you see Jung use them.
Yeah.
The kind of sheer kind of complexity, the interrelatedness, all the dynamic of it, that the changeability, what is in your control. Jung's grasp of that is so much richer,
right?
So much deeper. So he's able to go through the entire complexity, just like you're saying. For example, shadow is just kind of, moving your consciousness away from something that either you or other people consider desirable. But because you consider it undesirable doesn't mean that it is undesirable. People around you may be wrong, and you may be wrong in kind of calling it as undesirable. So there are many, many good traits which are there in the shadow. It's a question of just where the focus, the light of consciousness is shining. And I think what happens is that, like what I found again and again is that there is kind of individual personality shapes what it is that people focus on. So for example, I'll give you the comparison between Jordan Peterson and Joseph Campbell. See, Joseph Campbell is largely a positive person, and he will focus on the positive themes, follow your bliss. Whereas Jordan Peterson is, he will say, there is a monster in you, and watch out for that. Both are right, but they tend to focus on one or the other. So the relative focus is different. And somehow Jung manages to kind of take in all of that and kind of move very freely between the negative and the positive.
Yeah, I think Jordan Peterson says follow your blisters, and Campbell says follow your blisters.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, that's very good.
Yeah, I feel Jordan Peterson is way non on that level, like you said, Shrikant. Jung definitely has much more depth and created much more of a map of the psyche, and in all aspects, because he used so many different tools and format, like his drawing, his writing, Jordan Peterson is much more of a speaker, and because of that, he touched on more of this. I feel, I mean, from what I've listened from him, like a lot of the the talks he's put out, is much more of a sociological aspect of of humanness, and how how humans deal with those those aspects of the psyche in general. I don't know what's your thought on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, I do think, I mean, I will say a couple of things, right? Firstly, I want to say in the defense of Jordan Peterson, is that he's an amazing communicator.
Oh yeah.
And his ability to communicate things with crispness, with kind of moral power, of being able to kind of take in all these different fields and kind of make things real to anybody. That is truly amazing.
Oh yeah.
And I give a lot of credit for that to him. But in terms of depths, I think, you know, Jung is at a completely different depth. I mean, he's kind of like an explorer. I mean, he is, it's kind of, you know, it's like explore and exploit difference. You know, there are people like, he's just fascinated with the human psyche, and he's just discovering all the richness of it. And he just goes to the next thing, goes to the next thing. So it is difficult to actually see where he's going, because he's trying to cover everything. It's all connected, all interconnected. Whereas Jordan Peterson is very good at saying, okay, now let me bring it down. So, okay, what is the takeaway from this? So he's able to bring it down to a rule.
More solution oriented. I think more,
Yes.
you know, more modern in many ways, because
Yes.
of, you know, his approach. And that's why I think he's quite popular, is because, you know, his approach is very solution orientated and question based, and have a much more pragmatic approach. Well, like you said, you know, Jung seems to create a map, really.
Yes.
I mean, when you think about it, he's mapping and mapping and mapping all his life.
Exactly.
Until basically he died, basically.
Yes. Yeah. And the good thing about Jordan Peterson is that he would agree to what we are saying immediately.
Yeah.
He would say, look, yeah, Jung is something else. You know, he would say,
Yeah.
his intelligence is scary, he says.
Yeah, it's just for me, I just see the limitation with Jordan Peterson, because because he's so process orientated and so solution based, and you know, it's very modern in that approach, but at the same time it's limited. You see what I mean? Because
that is true.
from the standpoint of, you know, of individuation,
Right.
you know, you have to fit into that prism
Right.
of, you know, of what he's thinking, and, you know, and see that value. But everybody has their different process, and it might not resonate, I feel, you know, with everyone. You know, it resonates a lot with the segment of, you know, of the modern, you know, in some ways.
Yeah. No, I mean, the other thing is, you see, my personal approach to things is that I try to find people of this caliber.
Oh yeah.
I try to find as many such people. And what you do is that you're trying to be as objective. You know that everybody has limitations, including yourself, including Jung, including Jordan Peterson. And what you're trying to do is that you're trying to say, okay, what can I learn from these?
Oh yeah, of course.
You know, so you're kind of at the you know, so you're knowing their limitations, but kind of, you know, you need to have the you know, kind of empathy, saying that, you know,
I mean, I'm not talking about the man
no,
himself,
absolutely,
you understand me?
absolutely.
Like,
No, I
it's not
understand. I think we are on the same page. But I think what you do is that, like, if you take that kind of approach, then you're trying to just learn from people.
Sure.
And then different people will give you things, and you take whatever it is that you can get.
It's true. No, I totally agree with you. I mean, I guess it's part of that process, is seeing the value, and then seeing what, you know, what he brings. And, you know, and I do find a lot of what he says, you know, does have a lot. I mean, it's very, very interesting, because he pinpoint on certain aspects of things, and you're like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's just, where do you go further? That's sometimes my, you know, my question with what I hear from what he says is then, you know, you pause and you're like, okay, so now what's next, basically.
No, absolutely. And what happens is that, you know, there are people who are kind of at a level, like, for example, Jung was just the range of his thought. For example, he was able to take in the East, right? I mean, he understood the East. That is actually so tough.
Oh, yeah.
It's very tough, because, like, if you look at China, you look at India, and if you look at West, right? These are three very different cultures. They are so different from each other. They're kind of islands, you know, they're separated by this Tibetan plateau and the Himalayan mountains. So they're more like islands, you know, cultural islands, which are so different from each other. It's very difficult for people from one of these islands to understand the other. And Jung was able to do that. He was able to get to hearts of, you know, these things and kind of incorporate that. So he's at some level. I mean, the only people I've seen at that level are people like Leonardo da Vinci is another example of it. You just see the range, like, you know, and you compare it.
I mean, Rudolf Steiner, I feel like he's also on, you know, it's different, but he does have, you know, he does have his own philosophy, and, you know, and you know, he has developed a lot of, you know, his concept as well. You know, I feel like he does have, you know, does have an interesting way of seeing things as well.
Yeah. Who other people that you, what other people that you have found who are at, you know, who kind of give you a sense of awe?
I mean, honestly, like no one, I don't think anyone compared to Jung. I have most of Jung's book because,
Okay.
you know, and I've read them from
Mm-hmm.
from early on, from early age. I feel like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, you don't. I mean, I've read Steiner, I've read a little bit of Nietzsche,
Mm-hmm.
but I, you know, and I've listened to a lot of the Peterson,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, I still go back
Mm-hmm.
to Jung because it's, you know, it's like you said, you know, it has so much more depth.
Right.
I mean, you know, like Modern Man in Search of a Soul,
Mm-hmm.
like it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the,
Yeah.
I think the best
Yeah.
because it's, you know, I think what I feel is also because Jung is intemporal, like in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that, you know, when you read Carl Jung, it does relate to
Mm-hmm.
any you know, any age
Sure.
in terms of, you know, humanity in
Got
that
it.
sense,
Got
you
it.
know, because he does understand the core,
Mm-hmm.
you know, of the humanness and the, you know, those
Mm-hmm.
aspects that
Okay.
other philosophers are
Got it.
more
Got it.
temporal. You see what I mean?
Right.
They
Right.
move.
Yeah.
And
Ron, what about you? Who are the people who kind of fill you with awe?
Like I almost want to put two categories because when I read the kind of this deep spiritual masters, I
Mm-hmm.
almost want to put them in a different place than
Mm-hmm.
in whatever you would call the rest. So I would definitely put Jung. Like I can't think of anyone in that other
Mm-hmm.
space. And in some ways, I feel like he's the bridge,
Mm-hmm.
like in the more psychological Western world or whatever you want to call it. He seems to have that little in to that to the spiritual master stuff without claiming he's a spiritual master.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost remarkable how he's come around in the culture and is making this resurgence. It's almost like he did all this work back then and kind of bookmarked it,
Mm-hmm.
and now the culture is ready.
Yes.
And people like Jordan are like the
Mm-hmm.
carriers and inserting it
Mm-hmm.
into the culture and into the masses, and it's kind of Jung might be a bridge of sorts. And I know some people don't, you know, Peterson always points out for some people, due to the way they're configured and wired, the Jungian thing is just not going to be their approach. It's just going to be, so for some people, maybe lader, maybe in little pieces, but it's not going to be their thing. So I'm always mindful of that because I to not push it, especially if I'm coaching someone, because some people you get into the metaphor, symbol, dreams, and they're like, whoa.
Joe,
but you can use it subtly. If you can be kind of, you know, really subtle and magical about it, you can bring it in.
Joe, what about you?
As far as who, I mean, you know, Jung is, to me, it's been fascinating because I've just started to read I'm just starting to learn through this series. But the important thing that I've actually really been able to take away is how the analytical and the psychological compare and contrast to one another, and how that actually mimics itself within the virtual world. And some of the same very questions of like the intersection and our interoperability and some of those ideas and concepts. And that's why topology has actually really been an interest of mine as well, from the last meetup. But the other area that was really interesting that they hit on tonight was how the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious can work together. That's something I've thought about quite a bit, because I thought about that, how that is, you know, forms policies, and how that forms our frameworks and how society works in general. So this has all been very interesting to me because it's actually given me another level of depth that I've really needed in order to ask the right questions
Wow.
going forward. So that's I'm very appreciative of all this. I mean, I leave here with all questions and more, more
That's
than
the point.
answers.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that there is a special treat in store on if you're interested in typology in Jungian functions. There is a gentleman, John Beebe, who has done fantastic work on that. And that's, he's kind of combined Jung's theory of archetypes with the psychological functions. And he will be speaking. He will be speaking here next Sunday, not this Sunday.
Next Sunday.
After
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's
looking forward to
going to
that.
come. That. Yeah. Caroline, what about you? Which people kind of fill you with awe?
I guess like one of the panelists that I resonated most with was the Jungian analyst. I forget his name now. Brian. Yeah. And I think he was mentioning, I'm just going back to my notes. I always take notes. Narrative self-identity. So the story that we're telling ourselves and what we tell people about ourselves, and then what we blatantly leave out from our story. I'm particularly interested in that as it relates to the shadow and how to explore that in a practical way. So I know that Skip was mentioning, like, you can just really dive into your creative habits and see what comes out organically. And I think that Brian echoed that as well, and also added that there is no rush. Like, this is very much a flow process. It's like the river going down and you can't stop the river. So just noticing when, like, I guess on a personal level, like when I feel like I just want it to happen, like I want to have a realization, but it doesn't happen that way. I feel like with Jungian work, it's like very fluid and just noticing what's going on within you. And yeah, I'd imagine it takes a lot of time. So that's what I'm leaving. Yeah, there's a lot.
Wonderful, wonderful.
And I appreciated, I forget who said it, the importance of at some point maybe having a guide, like not trying to do it on your own. There's so many Jungian adept psychology resources out there. Of course, they're even online now, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the core things is to be kind of okay with the chaos of just kind of being open to what you can see, what you see, instead of trying to kind of prejudge and trying to kind of limit what you're going to allow into your consciousness. David, what about you? What feels, what thinkers kind of fill you with awe?
I mean, there's many, I guess, in the past, but the contemporary ones right now are a guy named Ken Wilber from, he created something called integral theory, and a guy named Alexander Bard from Sweden. And so those are two people who are very integrative, comprehensive thinkers that I'm really enjoying right now. Yeah. And Bard in particular, I guess, because he's trying to fit in a lot of modern digital technology into his philosophy and figure out the impact of that, how it's going to impact us as humans as we move forward into the future. But he's also not just taking some of these more modern technology, but also going back into the past, into deep history, looking at how humans developed as tribes and trying to emphasize the importance of that and reintroduce some aspects that we've lost from our tribe days, from our tribal days, but not have that same, but make it work and not have the negative tribal aspects as well. So, yeah.
What was the names?
Alexander Bard. Yeah.
Alexander Bard, B-A-R-D?
B-A-R-D.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very
I'll check them out.
And Wilder is the other one you mentioned?
Ken Wilber.
Or Wilder. Okay.
He created something called integral theory, which is like a meta theory trying to explain how so many different possible perspectives exist on certain topics, and how they can all have a certain aspect of truth to them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Olga, what about you? Olga, you're on mute. Yeah, go ahead.
No, for me, the maybe most interesting thing what was said today about that problem with initiation for the young man. And it seems like there are a lot of overcomplication and fragmentation. And it seems maybe this fragmentation in religion or in philosophy or in maybe in any field, it's this problem with initiation that every man try to prove himself and try to overcomplicate it. And I'm not sure, but I think it's all much simpler than what Jung saying or Peterson saying. Peterson's actually make it very structural. He wants everyone to understand him. And Jung much more closed. He want to prove to himself mostly, not to everyone. So it's probably it's correct comparison of Peterson and Jung, because one is opening itself himself, and one is closing and saying, no, I am my knowledge is very esoteric. It's my dreams, not your dreams. It's my dreams, and you have to understand it. Peterson saying, okay, this is this, this is that, and this is that, and you have to, kind of. He is very open. No, that's probably what I could say.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I think what happens is that personalities are very different from each other. But that's another kind of power of Jung's functions. So, for example, putting it in terms, where of course there is kind of disagreement about the functions of Jung. So, for Jung, for example, introverted intuition is very large. He's trying to form visions. So that introverted intuition function is one of his strongest functions. He's always trying to kind of pull together things and kind of create a vision. Whereas the mind of Jordan Peterson uses extroverted intuition of kind of seeing possibilities. He's kind of going out. And he's also trying to use, is very much of a TI kind of a thing, NETI. So he's kind of exploring things, and interacting with people is a core part of his way of understanding the world. So speaking things out and getting feedback and responding to that, which is very different from Jung, which is much more kind of introspective, introverted kind of thing. But that's a very good observation. Bobby, what about you? What did you get? What do you think? Bobby, would you like to say something? Okay. Ina, are you there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Hi. Hi. It was a really great discussion. So thank you for that. And I really liked it. But actually, who I really admire, I really like Stoics. And because they're very clear, you can understand the ideas. They're not very complicated. They're kind of you can live by those ideas. But Jungian ideas are also very necessary, because Stoics are not really concerned with psychology of the human being, but Jungian ideas are very much concerned with the thought process, and they can probably help you understand yourself and understand your creative process, because sometimes you're thinking, where does this come from? And maybe if you analyze the shadow and stuff like this, maybe it can help you better understand yourself and people around you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, we look at Stoicism on Saturdays, and we look at Jung on Sundays. And the interesting thing is that I think the Stoics have some basic ideas fundamentally right. I mean, the idea of dichotomy of control. I mean, I think that is really the foundation of Stoicism. simply understanding what is it that you don't fully control, so that you can focus on your entire attention of what is that is actually yours, and what is it that you can control fully and work very hard on. So it's like that distinction, I think, is the heart of Stoicism. But Stoics, when I say, I always look at people through intellectual history. Stoics are very early. So in terms of discovering the fullness of our emotional mechanism, our psyche, they are not there yet. I mean, this is very, very early in Western civilization. So people like Jung have a much richer and deeper understanding of the psyche than the Stoics. Stoics have that one piece down, and that's great. And so in that sense, for example, saying that be open to your shadow is applying the Stoic principle of saying, you know, accept nature. It's all about accepting nature, right? I mean, Stoicism is all about accepting nature, including accepting yourself. And Jung kind of starts with that principle of, you know, being open to admitting, accepting who you are. But then the entire grasp of what emotions are, how they function, the entire complexity, that, you know, Jung, you know, like people like William James, Freud, and Jung, they take it to a completely new level. So I think it's a good combination. So that's why, you know, we do that. So, well, folks, so this has been a wonderful. Yes, Bobby, go ahead. Bobby? Just a second. Bobby, go ahead.
Your technology is my challenge.
I have unmuted you. I have magical powers. Go ahead.
You hear me now, then?
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to say one name, Alan Watts. I started thinking of him, and with William James too. That concept that you just mentioned of that nature is that sort of the Taoistic approach to life, that you watch what's coming into your sphere and react to it from as deep within yourself as you can reach. And that takes so much of the pressure off of living.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like educate yourself and respond to what's flowing. And so that makes me very happy that I found your group, and I very much enjoyed tonight's entire presentation.
Well, it's wonderful to have you and all of you folks. I mean, this is one of the advantages. You know, now you're probably from all over the place. Where are you folks from? Bobby, where are you from?
I'm from Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas. Wonderful. And Caroline, you're from?
I'm from Toronto.
Toronto. Okay, very good. Faisal.
Here in New York.
New York. Okay. Joe, where are you from?
New Jersey, right outside Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. Okay. Ron?
Columbia, Maryland, near DC and Baltimore.
Okay. Olga?
From New York.
Okay. Ina, you're also in New York.
Yes.
And David, you're also in New York?
No, I'm Toronto.
Toronto. Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so this is one of the great things. You know, I think it's kind of, you know, we're using the fact that we are able to use this technology to get all you know, wonderful folks together. So thank you very much. I have to say good night, and I'll close these rooms in about maybe 8 more minutes at 11:30. All right. See ya.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Night,
Good
thank you.
evening.